But I would argue it's at that age that it's most important to continue reading to them at a level above their own decoding skills.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Chief Marketing Officer. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. Well, Andrew, today we are picking up where we left off last week. We did speaking, which was picking up where we left off the week before where we did listening. So listening, speaking, and so today we're talking about reading. Next week, writing. These are the 4 language arts that you talk about. So right. Reading seems a little one-off from what we do. Aren't we the Institute for Excellence in Writing? What is this reading? How come we're including reading in what it is we talk
there's
about?
Lots of reasons. One, of course, is the tradition of Mrs. Ingham and the blended Soundsight program that really was the birthplace of the structure and style. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Ingham was Dr. Webster's aunt, and so, the reading and writing developed together over the years there with the schools and the teachers in Canada. And there have been, from time to time, battles, discussions, debates about the best ways to teach reading. And, of course, Mrs. Ingham used, I think, the best of all worlds approach.
Mm-hmm.
She had a very solid, phonics-based foundation, but she brought it to life and made it multisensory. Which, of course, we know today has all sorts of benefits to children with different kind of learning styles or approaches or even neurologies, as well as the engagement level that we see from a motivation point of view. So her reading approach was incredibly effective, and for decades she taught that all over Canada. And it gradually trickled down to a few schools in the States, but really not as much traction perhaps as she would have liked. Now, of course, we have taken up the torch with the PAL program, and we have the PAL reading and the PAL writing, and then our schools division materials that are a continuation of Mrs. Ingham's approach for the 5-day-week classroom.
Right. Okay. So that's the learning to read. You can learn to read, which you would have to be able to read in order to write as the foundation for writing.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely true.
Okay, great. Let's talk about that.
But we do see this continuum of interlaced or interdependent skills. I started a couple weeks ago talking about how listening is the foundation for speaking. You can't really speak a word that you haven't heard, that you don't already know. Same thing with reading. You can't really read a word that you haven't heard or don't already know.
Okay, right.
Now, this is less the case as students get older and can start to infer or intuit the meanings of words from, say, an understanding of the roots or context. But in the basic stages, you use your word attack skills, your phonics knowledge, your tool sounds, whatever you want to call them, and you decode a word. And you know that that is the word that you thought it might be because you already knew it and it fits. I think I used the example of the word sleigh,
yes.
Right? You try to sound it out. Sleigh-ga-ha, 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 sleigh. What the heck is a sleigh-ga-ha?
Right.
And then you remember somehow that E-I-G-H says A. That's a letter combination, or what Mrs. Ingham would have called tool sounds, or a phonogram, depending on the vocabulary used. And you could say, oh, well, that's not sliga, it's sleigh, because that E-I-G-H says A. And that works if you have a previous knowledge of what a sleigh is. If you don't know what a sleigh is, then being able to say sleigh is about as useful as saying sliga.
Right.
So we do know that auditory database, for most all people, obviously hearing impaired or deaf people, it's a different world working in. But for most people, the auditory database of language is what makes decoding easier. And, of course, we also saw that there's research. The American Library Association promoted research that shows that children who are read to a lot, or, sideline, children who listen to audiobooks become older children who like reading. So it's that whole thing. Now, we've talked about on previous podcasts, of course, the fact that some kids have difficulty with the visual side of reading. You know, they look at the letters and the letters switch positions or flip around or reverse or spin, or they get very exhausted. And we have several podcasts on that question of, in the broad sense, dyslexia and how that relates to the acquisition of reading skills. So we can refer people back to that one.
Right.
What I kind of come to realize is there are, yes, indeed, better and worse ways to try to teach reading.
Okay.
But you can spend years using the best possible methodology and still fail to get a kid reading independently or at the level you want them to be reading. And you feel just so much frustration. As you know, my son Chris didn't read anything, really, till he was 10 years old or so, and he didn't read a book until he was 12 years old. Didn't mean he wasn't smart. He gobbled up audiobooks by the hundreds. So he was having the experience of putting into his brain, good and great literature, only he was kind of reading with his ears rather than reading with his eyes. So I think we tend to think of the definition of reading fairly narrowly, right? I mean, blind people read with their fingers sometimes. So why can't you read with your ears?
Right.
And I have often mentioned in the context of talking about him the remarkable phenomenon that he went really from 0 to 60 in a very short period of time.
Right.
He went from reading almost nothing to being able to read. I think the first book he read entirely all the way through was Bridge to Terabithia, which is probably what a grade 5-7 reading level.
Right.
And that was just probably in a 6-month period of time between starting to decode successfully and being able to read. Why? Because the database of language was fully formed.
Right.
And he had all that phonics information in there because we'd been drilling it for years and years and years. And it was just that moment where things kind of clicked for him. So I think it's easy for parents today and teachers too to have anxiety about kids who aren't, quote, reading at grade level, whatever that means, especially when they get, 8, 9, 10 years old. That can be very stressful.
Right. And yet, even if they're developmentally not quite ready to read, to have that foundation that you talked about, the phonics and the audiobooks, really helped him. So I want to kind of piggyback on that idea and just ask you, and of course my question is based on your talk, Cultivating Language Arts, Preschool through High School. What are some recommendations you can give to parents and teachers at the various grade levels, preschool, primary, elementary, middle school, high school, to develop these reading skills, whether or not, like those preschoolers, they're probably not developmentally ready to read? Although I know there's at least one person in this room who read at 4 years old. So
yeah. So and I meet people all the time who say, I have a 4-year-old who reads books by himself. I know people who say, I have an 8-year-old who has absolutely no ability to read a book by himself.
Yep.
So we really can't expect that children at a particular age or grade will just by merit of being that age or grade,
Yeah.
read at a particular, quote, level. And the more we can be free from that, the happier we'll be. But of course, with preschool-age children, they love to hear the same books again and again. We talked about the value of repetition, not just from building the language database auditorily and gaining understanding and those syntax patterns, but if they're at an age where they're looking at the words as you are reading to them, then they're getting the repetition of seeing those same words in that same sequence, hearing it, connecting the visual with the auditory, building the context with the picture. And so, very, very important to be reading. I would say, I think I have noticed over the years, I tend to like, and I think there's a good neurological reason for this, but I tend to like books that have the words very clear, visually discrete, not superimposed over a complex picture. Do you know what I mean? So some children's books have, big, bold, wild pictures, and then the text, you really have to work a bit hard to see and read that. And as an adult, of course, you can, but a child would not. Whereas I think the better done children's books have the beautiful picture, and then the text is separate and discrete and large, so that when they're ready to start looking at those words, they will be able to see them easily.
What I love about that, it's almost like accidentally teaching them to notice that words, those little lines on the page, actually transfer into thought and meaning. Yeah, it's you're not intentionally saying, now look here, daughter, here's the word, cat, and it goes with the picture. No, they're seeing,
right,
just
and it's
intuiting.
kind of an environmental thing. And as you teach them phonics on one side, there's environmental opportunity for decoding on the other side. And you remember being young, you walk around and you try to read signs. You're trying to figure out, what those signs mean.
McDonald's,
yeah, and
Taco
you
Bell.
figured it out. Well, those you might not have to figure out. But that reading to kids and letting them just sit on your lap and look at the book is so valuable.
Right.
And it's hard to do that in a school because you can't have, 27 kids sitting on your lap all at the same time.
Well, you and I both taught at the younger grades where we learned how to read upside down.
Right.
So you're showing the kids the pictures, but yet you're reading the text.
Yes, yes. I think it was in To Kill a Mockingbird that Scout Finch, the character, had learned to read already and then went to school, and the teacher was kind of appalled that she had already learned this. And she described just sitting on her father's lap, watching the words go by as he would read to her and just absorbing it that way. So some children do learn to read, it seems, with very little direct instruction or effort, and others takes a little bit more or a lot more.
Right.
And I've got kids on both ends of that spectrum. So I think the most important thing is don't have anxiety about when that happens. Now, there are, I think, better and worse ways to do direct instruction of phonics information.
So now have we moved into the primary grades?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, K1, 2. Mrs. Ingham's idea was to always mix the visual with the auditory, and if you can get a manipulative aspect of that as well. So she would have activities where children would put cards or pieces together to create words so they could see, this dual sound with this dual sound makes this word. And so it was a tactile approach. And, of course, a lot of children love the game element, the activity. Hey, I did that. I made that. So to the degree that we can recreate in our teaching of phonics kind of something that a child has a natural inclination towards, multisensory, tactile, mobility, and also the playful aspect of it. Maria Montessori materials, which you don't see as much at the elementary level as you do at the earlier grades, but they were also, color-coded and playful and like that. On the opposite end of the spectrum of playful would be some things that are just very, very dry. And here's the book for you, the mom, the teacher. It gives you the whole Orton Gillingham system, and now you make your kid learn this. Well, some people can bring it to life and do that well. Some kids don't need that playful enjoyment aspect, but others do. You may remember Sing, Spell, Read, and Write.
Sure.
Which I used with all of my kids, and when I ran a little preschool. I was a little disappointed last time I took at it because, of course, they jazzed up the music, and it wasn't as kind of pure and simple and joyful as I remember it being. I think, our PAL program does a good job of the balance between an organized system and the playful activity-based side. It does require, some work by the mom to organize and present it and stay consistent. But those who have used it successfully have been very, very pleased. I've met moms who bought it, 12 years ago and been using it with every kid since.
Yep. Okay, so now let's say they're elementary age, and let's just assume now that they're starting to read at a level that's, I don't even want to say age appropriate because that doesn't make sense.
It doesn't mean anything. But they're moving into the independent stage.
There we go.
Where if required or invited, they will read a book, on their own. We have a great tradition of children's books that are kind of increasingly complex. And I think a kid finally feels like, I'm really growing up when they graduate, quote, to chapter books. Yes. These books generally have fewer pictures. Children that age, upper elementary, they still enjoy pictures, helps build context, helps stimulate the imagination. But they have to do a lot more reading in between the pictures, and that's good. One way that you can, I think, help children get going in a book, so to speak, is read the first few chapters out loud, and then, say, I'm a little busy now, you can read on if you want. Or actually, the way I got Chris to read the first part of a chapter book, it was part of the Wilder King series, the Bark of the Bog Owl.
Okay.
Oh, I loved it. It's a great little series. But I read the first half or so of this book out loud to him, and then I had to go on a trip where I'm gone for 4 or 5 days. And I said, well, don't read ahead because, I want to know what happens too. But I left it in his room. By the time I came back, he had struggled through several more chapters and was very proud of him. Whereas I think if he had to start the book without that momentum of kind of already being in it, knowing who the characters were, having, imagined the scenario and could experience it. So that's a good way to motivate kids, is start reading an interesting book and then just get too busy and invite them to continue on.
You would have to pretend being too busy because most adults I know are not too busy already. Oh, wait, totally kidding. So when you're talking now, I'm thinking elementary age. It seems like there's 3 things you want them to do. You want them to read to themselves, silent reading, right? You want them to hear someone read to them, not forsaking that. You talk about that.
Yeah.
And then perhaps they themselves reading out loud, maybe to a younger sibling, or just so that they can hear themselves reading out loud, right? Wouldn't you say that?
That's a very, very good idea. We kind of have lost the habit of reading to each other, but I think it's wonderful when, especially in a family, if an older sibling who's, say, 10 and can read decently well would read to, a younger sibling or two, maybe just 15, 20 minutes a day, and build a momentum there. We had that kind of going in our home, and it worked very well until the last 2 came along because the boy, at 9 or 10 couldn't really read to his little sister who could have read to him.
Right.
Only, awkward. But yes, the other thing is I think we do tend to think that for kids that age, it's better for them to read on their own than for us to read to them. But I would argue it's at that age that it's most important to continue reading to them at a level above their own decoding skills.
Right.
So they can read, books that are appropriate at whatever, their reading age grade approximation is. And we can read to them good and great books that are something they wouldn't be able to read on their own. And then as we see words, we can stop, define the word. We see an illusion or some type of place or person that they may not be familiar with. And we can stop, kind of explain or define that, fit it into the context.
Get out the map.
Yeah, get out the map. And that's called creating comprehension.
Right, exactly.
So we want to continue with that. As kids move into, middle and high school, how to encourage them to read the better books. There's a lot of drivel out there. There's always a new wave of books that are aimed at the, quote, young adult reader, which really are, I think the word is misappropriated, young adult. It's more like drivel. But it's sometimes fun. It can be titillating. It can motivate kids to read instead of, play video games or do other stuff. We are seeing universally, even in adults now, a shortened attention span brought out by the, electronically hyperstimulating environment, that we live in. So it's really important to find those books that will grab the kids, but at the same time, try to find older books that may not be quite so shallow and maybe not quite so immediately gripping, but of greater lasting value.
Right. I remember the very first time I read Tale of Two Cities, and I just had to force myself to read this book, get through the first two chapters, because it just seemed like nothing happened.
Yes.
Until, well, I couldn't tell you. No. It's been a long time.
Well, that's the case of a book where if you did try to read that completely on your own, you might easily give up.
Yeah.
Best thing to do would be read it in a group so you can have a discussion. You get the audio and follow along.
Right.
Dickens is thick stuff, and you don't jump from Percy Jackson to Dickens overnight.
Right.
Right? There's a developmental process that has to happen.
You just said something that I want to just camp here for just a few more minutes, if you don't mind. You said get the book while you're listening to that. Can you talk about that? How would that be helpful?
Well, Dickens is thick, and sometimes the long sentences don't flow, and so you kind of read it one way, and it didn't go the way you thought, and so it doesn't make quite sense. Whereas if you can hear a good reader read the book, then that guides you through the context of the sentence and the flow into the next sentence. The nuance of the words, the emphases are enriching to the experience. So I did recommend that specifically with A Tale of Two Cities, to a couple kids and say, listen to it. If you want, listen and follow along as well and see if that helps.
Well, and the reason why that I latched onto that is one of my boys read very late, but I knew he had the intelligence. He could understand this high level of reading and thinking. He had a hard time tracking the pages, and so that's what I would do. Here's the Audible. Here's the book. See what you can do. And eventually he was able to, it's almost like training wheels. Yeah. He was eventually able to move away from the Audible and go right into the book.
Yeah, especially with some of that stuff that's written in language that is more complex and probably a bit antiquated compared to what we're used to on a daily basis today. I always suggest, if possible, follow C.S. Lewis's rule about reading. I even try to follow this rule myself, which is read one old book for every new book.
Okay.
Right. So if you read a new, whatever the popular fantasy or of the day, say, okay, that's good. Now let's try to find a book by someone who's dead. That'd be the defining line for me. If the author is dead, the book is old. Fair enough, right?
Fair enough.
And then you kind of have a balance. It's like food, right? You want a nice balanced diet. Some food is maybe a little less,
Nutritionally dense.
than other food, easier to eat, but maybe better for you. So I think you can build on that analogy and help kids understand. One publisher that I think has done a great job of resurrecting old books and making them available is Lamplighter.
Yep.
Mark Hamby and Lamplighter Publications. And they're not all terribly well known because what he's done is gone and found things that were good, especially from a character development point of view, in the public domain, but no longer really in print or readily available,
Right.
and then edited them up and put them in
Right.
nice versions. So that's a great place to look. And, of course, we've got our Timeline of Classics
Yes.
by Gail Ledbetter, which I think has over 1,000 books in it. Listeners can get that as an ebook download or buy a paper copy.
Yep.
And I think it's so handy because these days, a lot of people are less likely to know, well,
Right.
what shall I read?
Right.
And if you just go to libraries, they're not necessarily even safe places anymore to wander around and look for a book the way you and I might have when we were young.
Right. Or maybe there's no books in those libraries. We've
And
heard that.
and then, the libraries are kind of in a trend of getting rid of older books that aren't used as much and replacing them with the popular books that everyone's asking for.
Right.
So, building your own kind
Right.
of home or community library and keeping some of those, books that are just true classics that you could read again and again and get more out of them. Thinking of Hans Brinker and the Silver Skate. You remember that
I
one?
do, especially because I was a speed skater
Yeah.
in my days.
Right,
Yes, yeah,
right.
That's right.
So, looking in Gail's collection of the Timeline of Classics, they're organized
Right.
by either set in that time period or written during that time period.
Exactly.
And then they're labeled elementary, middle, or high
Right.
with the author and just a very
Right.
brief little bit of information that might be useful.
And she also includes in that resource some movie ideas.
Yeah,
and
some
other things like
audios. Yeah.
that. We just have a few minutes left, and I feel we would not serve our audience well if we didn't talk about high school and reading. And I want to specifically ask you your opinion about literature in high school and oftentimes the task of doing literary analysis.
Well, it's obviously something that many people believe is valuable and important because it forces a certain type of thinking that could be useful in the real world. I don't know that very many people in daily life do that type of technical literary analysis, but they do analysis, which is just basically the process of being able to ask the right questions
Right.
and divide things properly and make comparisons
Yep.
and talk about significance and relevancy and all that. I, as you know, would always hope to err on the side of enjoying the book more than rushing to analyze the book.
Right, right.
Because I think we can, in some ways, cause kind of a negative feeling about that book or about literature in general when we force a analytical type of activity,
Right.
especially if it's like write an essay.
Right.
Okay, it's like I always joke about book reports, What's the most significant result of a book report? Don't want to read a book again.
That's right. That's right. And I wonder, I think about how sometimes you recommend units 1 and 2 in our writing system. Just do several keyword outlines and choose one to do a unit 2 on. Choose one to rewrite. Maybe high school students could be given a list of books and choose 1 or 2 to actually do a written literary analysis, and everything else could be just a conversation with their instructor or their teacher.
Yeah, and conversations are comfortable places to be, especially if they're kind of in a bit of a Socratic mode where
Right.
the teacher doesn't necessarily have an objective. We will reach this point of understanding of this, let's explore this together.
Right.
Let's find out, does this resonate with you? Can you think of other things that this reminds you of?
Right.
And so it's a much freer, more lively
Right.
type of way to experience literature. But yeah, even as we become adults, I think reading books that other people are reading at the same time and then getting together and talking about it. I know my wife is part of this well-read mom group, and it's really a bright light, a bright point in her month to have a new book and then have the ladies all come over, drink tea, and who knows where the discussion will go.
Right.
This month they're reading Little Women.
Oh, of course they are. And truth be told, my husband and I started listening to that book right now just because the movie's out. And I don't know if we're going to see the movie or not, but right now I'm enjoying the book and he's not so much. I don't know why this is so. But I'm just going to give a little plug for our Structure and Style for Students course, SSS. We did include literature suggestions at all the different levels. Level A, some of those books are just picture books. Some of them are a little bit longer and deeper. Perhaps those will be read to them
and
by
some
their
kids will
parent.
read on their own. Other
Right.
kids will, hopefully a teacher or parent will read it to them if they can.
Yeah, and we're not giving any specific writing assignments that go with the book. We just wanted to give them a list of books that they could enjoy while they're writing about some of these other related topics. So I think we found a nice balance there.
I hope so.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for this conversation about reading.
Right.
I think it was very helpful. No, writing's next week.
Oh, that's
okay. See you then. Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, you can subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcast. Until then, on behalf of Andrew Pudawa and the team at IEW, I thank you for allowing us to partner with you on your journey toward better listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking.